Say hi to Arabile, our regular slot on the look at economics news for the past week. Thank you so much for coming through.
Sure thing.
The dollar at 14 to the rand rather at 14 to the dollar at 13-month peak. What's causing that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it hasn't hit 14 rand against the US dollar as yet, but it certainly could head in that direction, seeing massive weakness. Not so long ago, just on Wednesday, it was around 13 rand 40 against the US dollar. It's now trading around 13 rand and 87. It's lost 17 cents this morning. That's 1.25% lost just today alone. And primary reasons are not because of anything from South Africa. Right? What happened right now is really Turkey and the continued tensions and trade wars issues that are happening with regards to the United States are also a big issue. What's happened with Turkey is that they've actually detained a pastor who's actually from the United States, and that just means that the United States are going to retaliate and say to themselves, okay, we will then put in more trade issues and perhaps not take in any exports from the country of Turkey, which then means that Turkey itself, their currency is sort of weakened, which then affects the emerging market basket, which includes South Africa. That seems to have escalated. There's been people who've gone from Turkey right through to the United States. There have been a few diplomats who have gone through to try and solve the issue. Certainly no end in sight thus far, so that means continued weakness. And if this continues, then 14 rand certainly does become something that could possibly happen.
And you're saying the weakness is not determined by local determinants. As it says here, the business confidence of South Africa has gone up. But in spite of that, the rand is still performing weaker.
Let's remember that even though it's gone up, it's the first time in 6 months that business confidence has even gone up in South Africa. So even that, yes, may be a slight positive effect, but remember that the fundamentals in South Africa themselves are still negative. We still have unemployment at 27.2%. We still have a case where you might even see more job cuts which relates to mining sector in itself. The government sector is one that becomes of question as well.
Public service, the current Lekgotla that's just ended, fears that 30,000 jobs could be lost.
Indeed.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, a lot of people really speculating, and of course, but it's something that's come through from a source within the Lekgotla itself. You know, the two-day Lekgotla ending on Wednesday, and news coming out of that indeed 30,000 people may be let go of from the public servant sphere within 2 years' time. A year before elections, you certainly don't want that murmur to be ratified and for government to actually come out with a statement like that. But certainly it may be a necessary evil for South Africa, considering the fact that we sit with a wage bill, government wage bill, which is absolutely massive. Just that cut would save government 20 billion rand every single year. Now let's remember that Cyril Ramaphosa had a stimulus plan out not so long ago, and he needs 48 million rand for that, according to Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene.
So these are just in efforts to recalibrate the system, so that you
lose
jobs on this side and create jobs on the other side.
But now the problem is, if you haven't helped the private sector, for instance, take up those jobs, how then can you just let go of 30,000 people? Government has called Impala Platinum reckless for letting go of 13,000 employees over the next 2 years, which is what it announced last week. And yet they're going to do the same thing on the other side at a much bigger proportion. Let's remember that 30,000 compared to the millions that government employ obviously is not that big in terms of size, but still a large number of people that you don't want to be unemployed when your unemployment rate is where it is.
Let's just go back to those global impacts you were talking about. You started talking about Turkey, but China this week announcing that it's also instituting counter tariffs against U.S. products.
Tit for tat is
How's
not
that
ending.
going to work out?
Yeah, it's certainly not ending, is it? And let's remember that there's at least $550 billion worth of goods that China exports to the United States, and the U.S. is getting to a point in time, essentially, where all those imports from China to the United States will essentially have a higher tariff of between 10 and 25%, which then means that a whole lot of weakness is going to come through and hurt consumers.
But consumers also go to Chinese products because they think they're going to pay cheaper prices. But if tariffs have now got to be added on, that changes the game, doesn't it? It does
completely. And now the problem is the US has sort of been the leader in terms of current growth, if you take a look at it in the developed world. And if you continue to hit at that, as you're doing as the United States is essentially doing right now, that essentially means that consumers are going to struggle, that growth in itself will be stunted, and perhaps then the interest rate path won't be where they want it to be.
Another story this week, the US instituting sanctions against Iran. How will that impact on South African companies operating in that country? What comes to mind is MTN right now.
The biggest one, as you say, MTN, 3.4 billion is really stuck in that segment in itself. Let's remember. But out of the operations themselves, that Iran operation only makes 2.6 billion. All right, so they're saying to themselves, well, we have to repatriate more than we're actually making out of this place itself.
Yeah.
So they're actually saying they're not going to be investing in that Iran business anymore until they find a way to perhaps repatriate the funds. And of course, the sanctions by the United States doesn't make life any easier either. They've had to operate under very difficult circumstances in Iran, and that is bound to continue. And of course, that affects South African oil as well. Iran was a big importer of oil, or South Africa imported large amounts of oil from Iran. And when the sanctions broke free, essentially we got back to taking from them. But now that they're coming back, certainly how that picture falls is going to be quite interesting.
So, Arabile, when BRICS came about, one of the big promises they were making is to help the world unpeg itself from the dollar in terms of the global payment system. And that has not been achieved. When the US announces that it wants to institute sanctions against Iran, how does it then punish the countries, as Donald Trump has promised? How does he punish the countries that continue to do business with Iran?
As you said, because of that pegging in itself, it means that everything we do with regards to trade specifically, you first have to translate your currency into US dollars and then translate it into whichever currency you're looking at. Now, let's remember, as you spoke about BRICS, China becomes a huge influencer of African markets in particular, who have continued to take investment, take on loans, take on trade from China and the Asian peninsula in itself. So the questions become, why not just use the yuan or the renminbi as a form of trade instead? So instead of going into a US dollar, we take South African rands and we turn them into a yuan instead. That way you've sort of changed up your risk and changed the risk portfolio you may have when it comes to the US dollar. That is the one way to counter all of it. But can that actually happen is probably going to be a big question. A lot rides on the fact that the US still has almost everything measured in its currency, everything from the gold price right through to oil, right? So it's about how do we circumnavigate all those influences as well.
Let me take you back to when we started. We talked about implants and the impending loss of jobs and the possibility of losing jobs in the public space. Are workers ending this week anxious about their future?
I don't see why they wouldn't be. Let's look at what's happening at Eskom in itself as well. Right? So you also have an issue there. Yes, fine, they accept the 7.5% this year and 7% for the remaining 2 years, 2019 and 2020. But the fact that they may face disciplinary hearings is also a big question and a one sticking point for them. So very nervous on that front. You still have strikes which may happen in the gold and platinum sector, right? Impala Platinum said to cut jobs. And Impala Platinum have said that they've tried to find ways over the last 6 years in which they can find another method in which to do this, other than cutting jobs. And sadly, this is the only thing that they've come back with. Now, of course, communication with the unions is going to be quite huge in this front. But I think that workers themselves are certainly going to sit now and say to themselves, this country is not helping us in terms of just government because they're looking to cut jobs, but neither is the private sector. Where is our help going to come from? Sadly, it does look like a gloomy picture.
Arabile Gumede reports on the markets and the economy, and he's coming up in the afternoon, after 12,
Indeed,
on the show On Point to give you more on those economic stories. So look out for that. Let's take a break. You're watching The Agenda.